everyone, my name is Steph, this is the Novelty Corner, and welcome to another Psy-Changeling recap. Today we are talking about Elfen Knight, which is book 4 in the Psy-Trinity series, and is the 19th book overall in the Psy-Changeling world. This is my last novel reread before Last Guard comes out, but I am currently rereading Wild Invitation, and we'll have a video up for that hopefully very soon. As with all these videos, it's going to be a long one. Get yourself a cup of tea, get comfy, and let's talk about Elfen Knight. If you're at all unfamiliar with my recap series, I have been recapping every book in the Psy-Changeling series since last year. I'm nearly at the end of my journey, and I have loved every second of it. But as with all these videos, this is going to be spoiler filled pretty much from the word go. So if you haven't read the book yet, read it and then come back. Or if you don't mind being spoiled, then you're totally fine. The content warnings in this book are pretty similar to the rest of the series. You have a tortured hero who was quite literally tortured mentally and physically from childhood until adulthood. This one has quite an amount of negative self-talk as well, as a result of that torture and imprisonment. You also have general blood, violence, gore, all that sort of things, because we are talking about changeling pacts as well. And in this one in particular, there's a lot of changeling pack lore that is dealt out to various characters, which is different to the human system. So be aware of that going into the story. There is also the death of a close friend and the funeral that results from that, as well as estranged families. So this book is the relationship between Selenka, who is the Alpha of the Black Edge wolf pack in Russia. She finds herself mated to Ethan Knight, who is a telekinetic arrow who, instead of being able to move physical objects around with his powers, is able to move light particles. I'm going to jump straight into spoilers here, so you have been warned. Ethan's second power, and part of the reason why this book I think resonated so much with me and his development as a character, is not only is he a telekinetic, he's also an empath. And he was an empath who was trained to be an assassin, which is very antithetical to the whole idea of being an empath. But he doesn't know that for the majority of the book. And he believes that part of his mind is broken and that he is spiraling into madness, and that this rogue power, as it's referred to, is going to eventually kill him. So a couple of other things about the characters. Selenka, I don't know if we actually find out her actual age. If someone else picks up on it, let me know in the comments. But she became Alpha at 25. Her grandfather was the previous Alpha of the Black Edge Wolves, and he stepped down to let her take on that role because he believed it was her time to step up and take control of the pack. So there was no acrimonious handover, takeover, or anything like that. She was ushered into the role by her grandfather, who's still alive and still beloved by the rest of the pack. Her parents, Kiev and Vara, separated when she was 8 years old. Her mother was human and has since left the pack, remarried, and had 2 more children. So Selenka has 2 half-sisters who are 14 and 12, and Selenka was 18 when her oldest sibling was born. And she loves her mother, but they don't have a close relationship because she very rarely sees her. On the flip side, she has a very tough relationship with her father because her father is a dominant wolf, but she was far more dominant than he was. And so he was passed over for the role of Alpha in favor of his daughter. And so he's quite resentful of her and doesn't always respect her as Alpha. And so that causes a lot of tension in their relationship, which comes up throughout the story. So Ethan was an arrow. Because of his unique abilities, he was personally tortured and trained by Minglebon, who truly needs to die. We find out that as a child, his parents, his grandfather and his uncle tried to mess around with his brain because they recognized that there was something not quite right about him, which would probably have been the empathic tendencies that he had. He ended up killing all of them when he was quite young. He was taken in by the arrows. Ming personally oversaw his training / torture, and because Ethan's telekinetic powers are drawn from light sources, the only way to control Ethan was to lock him in a room without light, because if he didn't have any access to light, he couldn't use his powers. So Ethan spent the majority of his life, when he wasn't being sent out on missions, trapped in this black room, which is horrifying. It is noted throughout the story that Ethan has obsessive tendencies, and it comes through in his relationship with Selenka. He's interesting because he's not connected to anyone in the Psy-Net, and in fact the majority of the arrows didn't even know he existed until Abbott found him prior to the starting of this book, when the arrows defected from Ming's control. So he has connections to no one, and he very rarely trusts anyone else. All right, the only other thing to note before I jump into the plot points are that this deals with something that came up in the previous book, which is the idea of scarab syndrome, which was something that afflicted the Psy whose powers were reduced under silence. And the majority of the characters in this book, including the architect from the consortium who has been popping in and out of books since Allegiance of Honor, is affected by this syndrome, and it causes their powers to manifest at a higher level really quickly without their control. I think we're ready to jump into the book. As always, I'm going to talk about the book first, then I'll go through world things, and then I'll go through my favorite things that I loved about this story, and there's a lot of them in that list this time around. This book opens in 2083. We open in Selenka's perspective. She is at a symposium for the Trinity Accords. It's a gathering of all the three races to talk about various topics, and while she's there, she is approached by an arrow who she hasn't met, and he starts talking to her, and she notes that, one, he's very attractive, but also he has a really beautiful voice that her wolf is drawn to. And it's something that comes up over and over again. The wolves love to hear Ethan talk because there's just something in the tone of his voice that draws them to him. We find out a little bit later on in the book, but I'll mention it here because it's the reason why Selenka is actually at this symposium. When they were selecting people to represent the different changeling packs in the Trinity Accord, they tried to minimize the number of people, so they would pick one person who would represent more than one pack. So in the case of the San Francisco packs, Lucas Hunter is the representative instead of Hawk. And instead of Valentin being the representative for Russia, he nominated Selenka because he told her that she would be better at the political games than he would, and he would probably just roar at everyone. So that's why she's there. As they're talking, Ethan recognizes that there is about to be an attack, and he tells Selenka to close her eyes and sort of slams into her. She's very put out by this because she's quite a dominant wolf and she doesn't like anyone telling her what to do, let alone trying to protect her. But what Ethan is doing is using his powers to subdue the entire room. Basically, he's like a flash grenade. As long as he can hit people's optical nerves, he can knock them out for an indeterminate period of time, up to about 10 minutes. By telling Selenka to close her eyes, he's stopping her from being knocked out with the rest of them. The attacker was an Psy who had a gas bomb strapped to her chest. After Ethan saves Selenka from that attack, a second attacker tries to shoot Ethan, and in this case, Selenka is the one to pick up the attack, and she steps in front of Ethan, takes the bullet for him, and no one has ever done that before for him. And he spends quite a bit of time for the first couple of chapters just ruminating on the fact that someone he barely knows stepped in front of a bullet for him. We find out that the second attacker was also an E. We also find out that Ethan was tangentially involved in this attack. He was approached by someone called Operative Cray, who works for the consortium, and thought that Ethan would be a good target because he's so distanced and removed from the rest of the arrows. And Ethan really struggles to connect with people and to feel anything, and he basically wanted to see if there was some way to jolt him into seeing the world in colour. For him, it's just very grey and it doesn't have much meaning. Operative Cray wanted him to protect Selenka so that he could gain her trust and therefore have a way in to control the Black Edge wolves. Now, once Ethan meets Selenka, he recognizes a connection between the two of them. She actually makes him feel alive, and he starts his double cross, and he does admit all of his involvement in this up front very early on. Selenka then spends time talking to Silver and Valentin about this attack, and while she's doing that, he tends to the gunshot wound on her back. And then Aiden arrives, and he also is very concerned about Ethan. And knowing Aiden as we do from previous books, he feels really responsible for Ethan. He didn't know that Ethan existed, and he didn't know that he was continuously being tortured in a very specific way under Ming's supervision. He feels terrible about it, and he's desperate to try and find a way to connect Ethan to the world because he doesn't want to lose another one of his people. But at the moment, Ethan is quite removed from the situation. We cut away to the architect of the consortium, who we have since learned was female, and in this book we find out that she is also Psy, which I have suspicions about who it might be. We see that she's starting to shift her goals. In particular, she's really after trying to control all three races, and she will do anything that she can in her powers to achieve that. While talking to Ethan, Selenka teases him about skin privileges, but warns him that if he does anything to betray her pack, she'll kill him. And then, almost without warning, their mating bond slams into place. And this is within the first couple of chapters, so it is really fast. And they're both sort of left shell-shocked by it, especially Selenka, who is not sure how she could have found her mate, and this is just it. The whole thing rocks both of them. Through the mating bond, Selenka realizes that there is something not quite right about Ethan because their bond is there, but it's different and it's not exactly what she expected. It's kind of hazy. And Ethan really struggles to manage his emotion and his reaction to the mating bond. And so Selenka drags him out of this hall that's full of people, including some of her lieutenants who recognize that the mating bond has snapped into place for Selenka. So they don't really know what's going on either. She drags Ethan out of the room into a private room and kisses him for the first time, because they're both supercharged with emotion and the need for skin privileges and all of that sort of stuff, but they're not in a place where they can do anything about it at the moment because they're in the middle of a crisis. Once Selenka is sure that Ethan can maintain control and can function, they have a brief conversation where Ethan admits that he's not normal, or that he doesn't think he's normal, and he reveals a little bit about what happened to him in his arrow training, and she's horrified. But then they have to go back and they have to do their job, and Selenka, being an alpha wolf, has a critical job and critical role to play in sort of investigating what happened. So she leaves Ethan to sort himself out. She has a brief conversation with one of her senior lieutenants, Margot, who is also her security specialist, and Margot teases her about the mating bond. And then after that, Valentin also teases Selenka about the mating bond, and he should know because he's been through it himself. Then Selenka, Aiden, Valentin, and Ivy and Jaya interrogate the Psy assailants, and they basically find these two broken women, one who is struggling with the world and one who's just really angry, but they don't find out who put them up to it. While that's going on, Margot introduces herself to Ethan. After a brief conversation, tells him that she would rather give him advice on how to treat Selenka well than to warn him off, which is really nice because he's being accepted before people even really know him. And then Ethan speaks to Abbott, who is probably his closest friend in the arrows because Abbott was the one who found him, and asks Abbott for advice on how to make a woman happy. And Abbott is delighted and promises to send him the manual that the arrows have been compiling, the one that started with Judd and Vasek and has now just become a thing of arrow lore, really. Ethan's then contacted again by Operative Cray. Ethan plans on double-crossing him and trying to get as much information as he can to pass on to Selenka and Aiden. And while he's waiting for Selenka, Ethan is approached by a stray dog who just stays with him. We also briefly meet another Psy called Ezra, who is suffering from Scarab syndrome, and his powers are growing exponentially and he doesn't really know what's going on, and he becomes an important character as we go through the story. Selenka then returns to Ethan and she bites his neck rather possessively, and what we come to discover is she is an incredibly dominant wolf, and I love her for it. She's absolutely amazing. Even she's recognizing that this instant mating that they have between them and her instinctual response to Ethan is not the normal way of things, and she has always had trouble controlling emotions and her impulsivity, and this is just being exacerbated by this bond. It's at this point that Ethan admits his part in this plot. He explains exactly what Operative Cray wanted him to do, which Selenka thinks is funny, that the consortium thought that they could get an in by wooing Selenka. And he also tells her that he has let Aiden know. He apologizes to both of them. He didn't have any part in setting up the bombing or any of the attack. His goal was simply to save Selenka, to try and garner trust. And when Aiden comes to speak to Ethan, he suggests that he keep lines of communication open with this Operative Cray so that they can try and track him down and they can use Ethan to double-cross the consortium. And I like that all of that is acknowledged and done and dusted within the first couple of chapters so that it's not hanging over the whole book, because once the mating bond kicks in, Ethan's only allegiance is to Selenka. Selenka and Ethan head to Black Edge headquarters in the city so that Selenka can have her gunshot wound treated, and the need for skin privileges overcomes them again, and Selenka pulls them into an alleyway, and while they make out, Selenka refuses to have sex with him in an alleyway because he is a virgin, and she's like, we're not doing this in an alleyway, but they're both craving those skin privileges. So it's a really interesting dynamic. Selenka is a true alpha. She's actually probably one of the most dominant alphas that I think we've met, and I'm counting Hawk and Lucas in that. Ethan's not submissive. He is a dominant character, but he's a very different sort of dominant, and he can stand up to her. He just chooses not to. He would lay down his life for her. So while Selenka is being treated by Oleg, her PAX healer, Ethan explains a little bit about his powers. He's a telekinetic who physically can't move objects with his mind, but what he can move are light particles. And Selenka realizes that Ethan sees himself as a weapon because his power is very effective in creating a weapon. So not only can he knock people out, but he can sharpen that focus of light to become a laser. Or later on, we find out that he can also use it to cauterize wounds. While she's still being treated, Selenka is contacted and it's made known that a group that they know of as the Haven Disciples, which is made up of changelings, humans and Psy, has been caught graffitiing, I think, in Pact territory, and so she has to have people deal with that and with the group's leader Blaze, who is a changeling. But before any of that happens, one of Selenka's lieutenants, Emmanuel, is shot and he dies before she's able to get to him. And obviously this is quite traumatic for the entire pack and for her in particular, because he was her oldest lieutenant and someone that she confided in and trusted. And when she does finally get to Emmanuel, she finds that her father Kiev is there, and they have quite an acrimonious relationship, as I mentioned at the start, and she doesn't know why her father was there. Selenka has her wolves and Ethan investigate the scene, and then they need to start preparing for Emmanuel's funeral. It's at this point that we find out that Ethan suspects that he is a victim of scarab syndrome himself, and that there is a rogue power inside of him that keeps growing and keeps building internal psychic pressure in his brain. And he contacts Aiden and asks if Aiden will ask Memory if she'll work with him, because in the last book we learned that Memory is able to affect and help those people suffering from scarab syndrome. We also start to get more hints that Ethan is really good at picking up people's emotional cues, even when he possibly shouldn't be able to do that. He is able to support Selenka through her grief and her rage in really specific ways. And there's also other instances before that and after it where he picks up on things that he shouldn't be able to know. And he just thinks it's something that he's picked up along the way, the ability to mimic what normal people in his mind are able to do. But we begin to see that it's actually something more than that. They go back to Selenka's den, which is nicknamed the Warren because apparently someone thought that it looked like a rabbit warren, so that's what they called it. And Selenka goes to talk to Emmanuel's family and to grieve with them. And while she's inside their home, Ethan waits outside, stands guard at the door, and he meets various pack members along the way. And one of the healers, Evina, comes to collect the dog that's followed Ethan everywhere and to take the dog to be bathed and fed. And he also meets Zana, who is, I think, possibly 3 or 4 years old. And she adores Selenka, and she finds Ethan and she can smell Selenka on Ethan. So she starts talking to him. And it's really clear that what she wants is Ethan to hold her. And he realizes that. And so he just picks her up and holds her. And it's a beautiful little scene because even though Ethan is an arrow, he's incredibly dangerous, and he thinks that he's going mad, he also has a huge amount of compassion for the people around him, especially children. We then have a scene where Selenka introduces Ethan to her lieutenants. So there's Margot and Grigori, who are siblings. You have Alia and Artem, who are mates. And interestingly enough, Alia is a submissive wolf and normally wouldn't be included in a lieutenant hierarchy, but she's so good at what she does within the pack that they all just treat her as a lieutenant, and she is a really great character. And then you also have Ivo, Dinara, and Kostya, who are the other lieutenants. They all bring up the question about why Kiev, or Selenka's father, was at the same place as Emmanuel. They also note that the security cameras were taken out in that area and that there should have been patrol units, but they were reassigned by another emergency that was actually a diversion. And Selenka is the one to suggest that they start investigating her father because he had no reason to be there. Ethan's theory is that Emmanuel stumbled onto something unintentionally that he wasn't supposed to see, and that's why he was killed. While the funeral preparations are underway, Selenka asks Ethan to assist in the nursery with Alia. Ethan makes a note of just how peaceful and balanced Alia is, and he thinks that she's one of the most balanced people that he's ever come across. It's Alia who picks up that Ethan is incredibly perceptive about the people around him, especially when he's able to identify without being told that Margot and Grigori are siblings and that Margot is the older of the two of them. And then it's really adorable when Selenka comes to collect Ethan later on because he's in a room with a ton of sleeping babies, either in human or pup form, and he's just so beautiful with them. It's just a gorgeous little scene. During the actual funeral, which we don't actually attend because we're in Ethan's point of view, Ethan is standing guard for the den territory with Grigori, and the two of them end up finding intruders who are trying to burn down some of the trees. And they work out that these intruders are members of Blaze's Haven disciples and that there are a mix of changelings, Psy, and humans within the group who came in to set the fire. Ethan and Grigori are able to take them down, and there are a lot of injuries to the intruders, and Ethan's able to cauterize the worst of the wounds with his powers, which is the first time that he's used it in a medical capacity, which was something that he was really proud of when he was growing up and he learned how to do because he thought that Ming could use him to help heal people. But of course Ming is not like that at all, and only wanted to use him to hurt people, and so poor little Ethan was crushed. This is the first time he's actually had the chance to use it in that capacity, and it's noted by the healer when they come over that it's actually very precise work. And in some ways, Ethan's telekinetic powers very closely mirror what Judd's TK cell powers do, in that he works on a very specific, very small level in order to be able to cauterize wounds or move these light particles. It's an interesting version of telekinesis that we haven't seen before. Once the funeral is over, Selenka comes to deal with the intruders, and she hands out changeling justice, which basically means the changelings will have to go through a fight bout with another member of her pack, and that the humans and the Psy will have to do hard labor. And the humans and the Psy are shocked by this, but as she tells them, they committed crime in pack territory, and so they're subjected to pack law. The justice system won't step in because they chose to do something in a space where changelings are the law. And we've seen this happen a few times in the books, but this is, I suppose, the first time that we've seen it dealt out with a much larger group of people and across races as well. Selenka also contacts Blaze and lets him know that his people will not be returning until they've completed their punishments, and he's rather put out by this because he was planning on punishing them himself, but Selenka refuses to let them go. And he has to bow down to it because he is a smaller pack leader in her territory, there at her discretion. And because the disciples are increasingly becoming a problem, Selenka is now having to decide whether or not she's going to allow them to stay in the town or whether she's going to have to send them out. There's a really great scene between Selenka and Ethan as they're walking back to the Warren, where Selenka is trying to explain what it means to be an alpha to Ethan, and the fact that she has friends within the pack, but she will always be their alpha. And so it's a level of distance between her and her closest friends, regardless of what she wants. And so while everyone is grieving the loss of Emmanuel, she can show her grief, but she can't show the extent of it because her people need her. Ethan, being her mate, but also existing outside of pack hierarchy, is the only person she can be herself around. After Ethan helps Selenka console and spend time with her grieving pack mates, they end up in her private quarters and they're in the shower together, and he washes her hair, and it's a very intimate, very quiet scene because it's the first time that she's able to cry over the loss of her friend. And then Ethan also explains to her the problems that he's having with scarab syndrome. Selenka tries to point out that he doesn't seem like he's going mad, and later on she does a little bit of research into scarab and has to acknowledge that the symptoms that he is describing do match the scarab syndrome symptoms, but even she's not 100% convinced. After all of this, they do have sex for the first time, and this is a really fascinating scene, and to me it felt quite unique in this series because, as I've said before, Selenka's dominance is really clear. The whole time that they're working out what it is that they're going to do and how far they're going to go, she is expecting clear communication from him the whole time because she knows that he's inexperienced, and her wolf is uncomfortable with him just submitting to her. And we've had other books with really strong dominant female characters, but they've always been paired with other changelings who are also dominant in their own way. So this was a really interesting dynamic, and I really loved this scene because, yeah, communication was the hallmark of it, and it was great. Operative Cray is found by the Arrows and Abbott in particular, and Abbott lets Ethan know that they've got him in custody and promises to keep him in the loop as they question him. The next day, Selenka's grandparents arrive in the Warrens. Her grandmother, Lada, who is a submissive wolf, and her grandfather, Yevgeny, who was the former pack alpha. And she takes Ethan to meet him. And along the way, Ethan, collects a wolf cub who just hangs out in his arms as he goes to meet the grandparents of his mate. Ethan's dog is also returned to him, and he gives the dog the name Loyal. So Loyal now follows Ethan everywhere. Selenka is really nervous about Ethan meeting her grandmother because her grandmother tends to struggle around other dominant characters. But when Lada sees Ethan, she gets up and she greets him, and then she calls him the strangest dominant she's ever met. And in spite of all of that, she likes him, and Ethan asks her to help him court Selenka because the one thing that Selenka has missed out on is the courting process because their mating bond snapped into place before any of that happened. We cut back to Ezra, the Psy who was struggling under scarab syndrome, and he wakes up in a strange place. He doesn't know where he is. He works out that he's possibly in Seoul, which is strange because he went to sleep in his home in New Zealand, and he's a teleport-capable telekinetic who can only travel short distances. So the fact that he has teleported in his sleep so far is a clear sign that his powers are going a little bit haywire. Selenka and Ethan then meet with Memory and Alexei, and Alexei has some ties to the Black Edge Wolves, although it's complicated. From the previous book, we know that Alexei's brother, father, and grandfather had all gone rogue, so Alexei has sort of distanced himself from his Russian family, but he does still have family within the pack. When Memory meets Ethan, she feels an instant connection to him, and she wants to know if they've met before, because she feels like she knows him. And as she begins to try and investigate the extent of his scarab syndrome, she actually can't find anything, and she doesn't think that he has it. And as they're discussing his powers and the way that he's shielded his mind, he has these incredibly strong shields. And she suggests that what he probably needs to do is to separate the shielding that he already has and have one for his telekinetic powers and one for the rogue power that he doesn't understand yet. And she suggests that they get Sasha in to help him rebuild those shields so that they can actually try and figure out what is going on. But she's very convinced that he's not going to go mad from scarab syndrome, even though he knows that if he drops the shields, he's just going to suddenly start hearing all of these voices in his head. And he likens it to hearing screaming voices. Before they can do anything though, there is a large-scale event on the Psy-Net, and Aiden and Caleb need Ethan's assistance in order to knock a huge number of people unconscious. So he goes and he does that. And then when Ethan goes into the Psy-Net to actually look at the affected area, he sees that all of the Psy minds connected in that space are crawling with these parasites, and it sounds utterly creepy. And the weird thing is that Aiden and Caleb can't see them. So Caleb asks Ethan to sort of contain one of them, and then Ethan suggests that they get Memory to come and have a look because she's the cleaner of the net, as we learnt in the previous book. And it turns out Memory can also see them, and she's really freaked out by these parasites. She's able to use her powers to clean the area and to kill the parasites attached to the mines. But then there's a second event, and Memory is wiped out from using her powers, and so Aiden and Caleb ask Ethan to try and use his light powers on the Psy-Net level to see if that will have any effect on the parasites, and it does. The result being that he ends up flaming out, and before he passes out, he asks Caleb to take him back to Selenka. And so Caleb literally drops Ethan in Selenka's arms in the middle of the forest in her den territory and then leaves because he's really not supposed to arrive unannounced in her territory. And with Ethan unconscious, Selenka's really not sure what to do, and so she ends up contacting Silver Mercant. And she has a great respect for Silver, except for the fact that she made it a bear, and she thinks that Silver's lost her mind about that. But overall, she respects her as a woman, and a very strong, powerful woman in her own right. And she asks Silver's advice for what to do now that Ethan's unconscious. Silver gives her some generic advice and then connects her to an arrow. And then that arrow gives Selenka some additional advice and then lets her know that Ethan's mind is currently being protected by the arrows on the Psy-Net because all of his psychic abilities are out. And Axel also lets her know that there is another shield around his mind, one that has teeth and is basically telling everyone to back off or they're going to be attacked, which is Selenka's mating bond protecting Ethan. Selenka contacts Oleg and asks him to bring out some supplies to where they are, and essentially rather than trying to get Ethan back to the Warren, they set up a tent, they move him into the tent, and they have supplies out there so they can stay there as long as they need to until Ethan wakes up. There's an issue with the pack and Selenka has to go and deal with it, and Oleg convinces her to go and says that he'll wait with Ethan. The incident is Vadim, who is Emmanuel's brother, and he is having trouble controlling his aggression in the wake of his brother's death, and he needs to let it out. And so he and Selenka have a fight, and it allows him to get his aggression out while still being kept safe by his alpha. And then there are a whole bunch of other things that mean that Selenka can't go back to Ethan and she has to do her job. And she's one amazing alpha. She does all of the things that her people need her to do at the expense of her own concern over Ethan, and she does it because it's her duty, and that's what she signed up for. While she's still in the Warren, Margot lets her know that they think that there is a connection between the Haven disciples and what happened to Emmanuel, and she asks Margot to continue to look into it. And when Selenka is able to go back to Ethan, it's nighttime, and so she sleeps beside him that night, and she's also taken Loyal out with her. He still hasn't woken up by the morning, and Selenka and Grigori need to head out to meet with Blaze at his compound. And it's here that we learn a couple of interesting things. So Blaze basically runs his compound like a cult. And when they first turn up, Blaze is walking out of a room with a 19-year-old girl, and Selenka is disgusted because he's 43 years old, having a relationship with a 19-year-old who is one of his followers and looks at him like almost like a religious leader. And that doesn't sit right with Selenka. And after their conversation, Selenka has to threaten Blaze with the fact that if he doesn't keep his people in line, they'll no longer be welcome in the city, which is part of Selenka's territory. We have a small chapter where the architect connects with Ezra and plans on using him and his growing scarab powers to her advantage. Valentin also contacts Selenka, and the call is basically to commiserate the fact that they're both alphas mated to very strong Psy, and that when they go down they actually can't do anything to help them. And at the end of it, Selenka finds herself agreeing to go and have a beer with Valentin, which is not a great idea because when the wolves end up going out and drinking with the bears, something always goes wrong. And when Selenka tells Margot this, Margot promises to bail her out of jail after whatever happens as a result of going for a drink with Valentin. This time when Selenka goes to see Ethan, he ends up waking up, and this is the second time that they have sex, this time outside in the woods in the tent. After all of this, when Ethan contacts Aiden to let him know that he's up and running, although his psychic powers are still out, Aiden wants Ethan to join Caleb and Memory on a comm call. Aiden and Caleb are really curious about what it is about Ethan and Memory that allowed them to see the parasites on the net. And then they invite Nikita into the comm call as well, because one of Nikita's minor abilities is the ability to create mental viruses. As it turns out, she can also see the parasites, but this is something that is much stronger than what she can do. And usually when she uses her ability, it's very targeted. It's not something that is so widespread. Ethan theorizes that what it could be is someone who is suffering from scarab syndrome who has the same mental virus ability as Nikita, but has suddenly gone cardinal with their abilities. And of course we find out that the architect is the person who is responsible for the virus. Selenka and Ethan then head back into the city to work with Sasha, and Sasha's there to help rebuild Ethan's shields, and she arrives with clay. Sasha also tells Ethan that she doesn't think that his mind is disintegrating at all, or deteriorating, and she helps him build 2 new shields from scratch. Ethan is really amazed at her ability to build shields so quickly, and we've heard time and time again that she is an incredible shield builder, but he then asks her if she's ever told Aiden what she's capable of, because he thinks that some of the arrows could learn a few things from the way that she builds mental shields. The Psy-Net is attacked again, and Ethan is asked to help try and track down the assailant, and he's unconscious for about 90 minutes, during which point Selenka has to leave and deal with some things to do with the pack. So she leaves Ivo with Ethan. When he wakes up and they've managed to catch the person responsible, Ethan and Ivo are teleported to a Psy-Med center to visit the assailant because they wonder whether Ethan will be able to get any information about her, which he isn't able to do that. And then when Ethan and Ivo are driving back to the Warren, it's much later at night and they end up stopping because it looks like there's been a car accident with a car being crushed by a fallen tree. They both think that it could be a trap, and as they get out very slowly to investigate it, they're both attacked. And it's Blaze and his sister Namani. Namani is killed by Ivo, and Ethan manages to knock Blaze unconscious. Ivo reacts really badly to having to kill someone, and Ethan actually talks him down from it and takes care of him because it's not something that comes naturally to Ivo, and Ethan reveals his own fear of the dark to Ivo in order to build a bond between the two of them. And it's an interesting scene because we get to see a changeling who is not comfortable with violence, because even though it's part of the changeling life, it doesn't mean that everyone deals with it in the same way. And even Selenka comments on it later on, that the way that Ethan was able to support and treat Ivo through that experience showed an incredible amount of care and emotional intuitiveness. While they're waiting for Selenka to turn up at the scene though, her father also shows up, and he is beside himself with the way that Blaze has been treated. And when Selenka turns up, she works out that Blaze is the one who shot Emmanuel, so he's sentenced to pack law, which means that he will be executed by the pack. And we find out that the reason that Blaze has been attacking the Black Edge Wolves is because his father was exiled from the pack many years ago for embezzling pack money, and it was Selenka's grandfather who kicked out Blaze's father, and she hands Blaze over to Emmanuel's family, who have the right to execute him. The pressure building up in Ethan's mind from his rogue powers continues to grow, and so they need to test out the new shields as soon as possible. Selenka takes him to a small abandoned den within her territory that belonged to a previous pack, and because Ethan is so worried about what will happen if he goes mad, Selenka has chosen this place because it's dark, because there's no artificial light inside. So once they close the door, it will be pitch black and he won't be able to use his light powers. Aiden, Memory, Alexei, Sasha, Lucas, Selenka, and Kostya are all there to support Ethan as he drops his shield. And when he does, he's overwhelmed by hearing things inside his head and he struggles to get his shield back up. Once he does, though, they don't even have time to address what it was. Sasha and Memory have kind of worked out exactly what it is that's going on with him, but he doesn't have time to talk to them about it because there is another incident on the Psy-Net and Aiden and Caleb request his help. When he does return, though, he talks to Sasha and she's the one to break it to him that he is an empath and he's an incredibly powerful one. He sits, I think they said, 9.5 or above on the empathic scale, so he is almost close to cardinal, and that the reason that he started hearing voices was because the first time that he started dropping his shields, he was in the middle of a crowded park. You know, this is where I said at the start of the video, part of the tragedy is that empaths feel everything, which is why Ethan is so emotionally intuitive, and makes it all the more heartbreaking that Ming took an empath and made him into an assassin and didn't give him any choice in the fact that he had to kill. We find out that the last attack was initiated by Ezra, and Ethan goes to try and talk to him, but Ezra isn't able to give the information about who is responsible and who gave him the idea for the attack before he goes mad and he eventually dies. We find out afterwards that Memory and Ethan are distantly related somewhere in their family tree because their powers are very similar in nature in that they have a very particular way to help and clean the net. There's a really lovely scene where Ivo and Oleg have worked together to try and do something for Ethan, and they design and implant a little light in his palm that he can turn on and off. There's a little sensor so that he'll never be truly in the dark ever again, so that if he ever finds himself that way, he's got a light source. Margot does eventually get Ethan hooked on Hourglass Lives, the changeling soap opera. They're planning a marathon the night that Selenka is going out to have a drink with Valentin. Before she goes, Selenka can't stop herself from offering commentary on how ridiculous the show is. Once she leaves to go for this drink with Valentin, we find out that it's a ruse and that Ethan asks Valentin to cancel it so that Selenka is redirected back into Den territory where Ethan has set up a date for her. And it's all very sweet because he sings to her and it is adorable. The very last thing, it's like the last paragraph in the book, is that we have a scene with Aiden and Caleb and they're looking at the net which has begun to fracture, and they make the decision that they have to break the Psy-Net into smaller pieces in order for it to survive. And that is the cliffhanger that we end on for, I'm assuming, the next book. So that was the book overview. In terms of world building things, we have the architect of the consortium is confirmed not only to be female but also Psy and suffering from Scarab syndrome, and she's collecting minds affected by Scarab syndrome to do her bidding. I don't think that this character is someone that we haven't met yet. I suspect that it is possibly Shoshana Scott. She's the last standing council member who was ousted that we don't know the fate of. So my bet is on her. Could be wrong, but that's where my thoughts are at the moment. I talked a little bit about the fact that Selenka inherited her alpha status from her grandfather. While Ethan was held in captivity, he only ever saw one other arrow, and that was Axel. And it should be noted that Axel never saw Ethan. And initially, Ethan really struggles to be around Axel and even gets into a fight with him because Axel is associated with his time in captivity, even though Axel wasn't involved in any way. And at the start of the book, they're sort of entering into this tentative truce. Continuing on from Silver Silence, we find out that Arwen Mercant, Silver's brother, is still in contact with the Bears. And we find this out when Selenka is thinking about an incident where she had to bail some of her wolves out of jail because they were out partying with the Bears and Arwen, and that's when she figured out that Arwen is actually an empath. Theodora is still continuing to keep Pax in line, so Pax is still struggling under Scarab, but Theo is keeping him in line. It's only a really brief scene. Ethan makes a comment that the Arrows are undergoing child management classes because they need to learn how to behave differently around children compared to how they were raised. Also, that connection between Alexei and the Black Edge Wolf. So Alexei is cousin to Kostya, one of Selenka's lieutenants, and Kostya just finds it hard to believe that he could be related to a surfer-looking wolf from the west coast of the US. And then some fun things. Okay, I love how much time we spend with Selenka being an alpha. She's freaking amazing. Also, Selenka has the best style of anyone so far that we've met in the book. Her black hair is streaked with pink and purple at the start of the book. She always has her nails done, and she's let one of the younger members of her pack put cartoon cats on her fingernails. And she also loves makeup, and she even talks to Ethan about why she enjoys doing her makeup. Selenka was also featured in the Sexy But Scary column of the Wild Woman magazine, which was referenced in the previous book because Caleb was also in that same column. And I should point out that we find out a lot more about the relationship between Valentin, Selenka and Caleb and the way that they maintain a working relationship in Russia, because they are the three most powerful alphas in the area. We get a lot of stories about the bears getting the wolves into trouble, usually after going out drinking. Selenka's reaction to Silver and Valentin's relationship is absolutely hilarious. I think I talked about it earlier, but she had always thought of Silver as being this very smart, strong, capable, independent woman who then fell for a bear. Selenka's grandparents are absolutely amazing. I love them. They raised her after her parents separated. Her grandfather decided that his son wasn't fit to raise the future alpha of the pack. They're really protective of her, but they're also really accepting of her relationship with Ethan. Margot encouraging and converting Ethan to watching a soap opera is just, I love it. Throughout the whole book, Selenka calls Ethan her little rabbit in Russian, and the whole thing is a joke that amuses her greatly because she tells him when he asks that he's the furthest thing from a rabbit that she can think of, and so calling him a little rabbit just delights her inner wolf. We learn that Ethan is a neat freak and also that he knows how to do origami. He was trained to do that in order to calm himself and to find focus, and he makes a origami howling wolf for Selenka. According to Grigori, Selenka is a terrifying driver and he wonders how she got her license. After all the outdoor sex that Ethan and Selenka have, Ethan plans to add an outdoor recreation section to the Arrows manual. And the other thing that I want to mention is that during that comm call between Memory, Caleb, Aiden, Ethan and Nikita, Memory and Nikita have the funniest conversation. I swear, anytime Nikita has a conversation with an empath, it always devolves into them nitpicking at each other. And it starts off with Memory going, I don't understand how you are Sasha's mother. And it just devolves from there. And the whole scene just had me giggling because they just bicker at each other, and it was great. The other thing that this book has are some really fantastic quotes, and I might actually put them in the description because otherwise this video will go on forever. But there are some really amazing quotes around acceptance and relationship in here that are just amazing. All right, so that is my recap of Alpha Knight, which I love and adore with all of my heart. Is in my top 5 books in the series. Gosh, it's getting crowded up in that top list. That's it for this wrap up. I am going to have the wrap up for Wild Invitation hopefully up very soon, and then we'll be hopefully getting Last Guard. I'm hoping. I've pre-ordered it. It should be arriving very close to its release date, and I'll be reading it straight away, and then I'll have the final, for now, video in this series coming out. So we're almost there. In the comments, I would love to talk to you about this book, so feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments section. Or if you want to let me know that you're here but you don't want to leave a comment, feel free to leave a fireworks emoji, since Ethan has this fantastic light power. I hope that wherever you are in the world, you're staying safe and healthy, and I'll see you in my next video. Thanks so much for watching. Bye everyone.